Good afternoon, everybody. I want to first apologize for the delay in starting the webinar. We've had some technical issues on our end, and hopefully they have been remedied. This is our second in the Daniel and Marissa class anti-Semitism lecture series. I want to give them a special thanks today for their generous support of the series. Their donation has given us the opportunity over the next 4 years to welcome speakers such as today's speaker, Dr. Shira Klein, who look at anti-Semitism, its past, and how it affects the present. I just want to make sure, Shira, are you able to turn on your video?
No, it still says the same thing.
Okay. So all of our participants, please hold on just a second. We're going to make sure that we get Shira's video up and working so that you're able to see her as she speaks. Again, I do apologize for the technical difficulty on this end. This did not happen in the last lecture for those of you who attended at the last one. While we're working on that, I want to wait to introduce you, Shira, so that everybody can see you when I go ahead and introduce you. The lecture today is titled Anti-Semitism on Wikipedia, Distorting the History of the Holocaust. As many of you know, anti-Semitism, there has been a resurgence of anti-Semitism, and one of the places where it is frequently happening is on anti-Semitism, and that's what Dr. Klein is going to speak about today. All right, we're going to go ahead and start. I've spoken with Professor Klein about this. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome Dr. Shira Klein today, who is an associate professor and the chair of the history department at Chapman University here in Southern California. Her two primary areas of expertise are Italian Jewish history and knowledge production on Wikipedia. I'm sorry about that. She's the co-author of Wikipedia's Intentional Warping of Polish Jewish History in the peer-reviewed Journal of Holocaust Research. It was published in February 2023, and the article has been viewed over 50,000 times worldwide and reported on in both newspapers and magazines across the world, including Slate, Der Spiegel, which is in Germany, and the Gazeta Wyborcza in Poland. Altmetric has ranked that particular article's online visibility, and there she is, wonderful, has ranked those articles' online visibility in the top 5% of 25 million research output, and it's under contract to be translated into Polish and Hebrew. Professor Klein's book, Italy's Jews from Emancipation to Fascism, which was published by Cambridge University Press, was awarded finalist for the 2018 National Jewish Book Award and is now under contract to be translated into Hebrew. She's received multiple grants, including from the National Foundation for the Humanities, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture Research, from our institution, the USC Shoah Foundation as well, and from the Barbieri Foundation for Modern Italian History. And I just want to apologize again to Professor Klein for the technical difficulties. I'm glad that we will be able to see you when you give your talk about anti-Semitism on Wikipedia. I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. All right. So let me share my screen. And thanks, Rachel, for making the video work. I appreciate that. Okay, is Jennifer, is this visible? Jennifer, is this visible? Is the PowerPoint visible?
It is visible, yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, let me start with a story, and all good historians start with a story. So this story begins on a chilly November evening in 2018 in California, when a student of mine named George went into Wikipedia to submit an assignment. The assignment was due at 9 p.m., so of course he submitted it at 9:15. Now you might be wondering, since when do students do their assignments on Wikipedia? Well, I've been teaching students to edit Wikipedia for the last decade, and I've overseen a total of 180 students who've added a combined 65,000 words to Wikipedia articles. It's a great type of assignment pedagogically, and the way it works is students pick a topic that they're passionate about within the area that we're studying about in our course, and I do this in multiple courses. Then they find a reliable secondary source, which means a source that is peer reviewed, that was published with a reliable press by a source that is by a scholar. And then they hunt around on Wikipedia and find an article on Wikipedia that they can improve with that source. After that, what they do is they go to the article's talk page, and this is what a talk page looks like. Every single article on Wikipedia that is public facing has a talk page. The public facing portion is this one over here where it says article. That's what we all see when we Google something and we open Wikipedia. And then fewer people notice this little tab called the talk tab. So my students, when they figure out what it is that they want to edit on Wikipedia, they go into the talk page and they announce the community to the community of editors on Wikipedia what they plan to edit, and then they wait for the community's response, and then finally they go in and make the edits. So in George's case, he wanted to write about Jewish life in post-war Poland. My course was on Jewish history, 3,000 years of Jewish history, and he just said, you know, the post-war period interests me. I want to write about that. So we picked out a book together. He and I picked out this book for him to use called Fear by Jan Gross. And Gross is a professor emeritus at Princeton University. This book was published by Princeton University Press. So he's widely considered to be one of the top authorities of our time on Polish Jewish history. And I told George, yeah, this is a great secondary source, very reliable. You can go ahead and use it to make your edits. And the first thing George did was to go and post on his talk page. And he and I expected that his suggestion would go unopposed and it would all go smoothly, as it usually does with my students. Instead, within hours, an editor called XX236, which is of course a username, a pseudonym, posted this angry rebuttal to what George was suggesting. And he said, no, this book by Fear is not, this book Fear by Jan Gross is not at all reliable. And this editor actually hinted that post-war anti-Semitism, which is what Jan Gross's book is about, was actually the fault of the Jews. I looked at this and I was sort of taken aback and I said, yeah, this is just a fantastical accusation. And I weighed in on the talk page and there was this whole debate, this whole back and forth that lasted several days. As you can guess, by this point, George was probably sorry he'd ever taken my class, much less picked this very apparently explosive topic. And this incident to me was really interesting because it served as a warning bell that something was awry on Wikipedia. And I later discovered that this little skirmish that we had was the tip of the iceberg, and that there was a whole group of editors like XX236 that were committed to what I call a distorted narrative of Polish history in multiple articles. So I sought out at this point Dr. Grabowski, Jan Grabowski, who is a professor at University of Ottawa in Canada. And he had also noticed some distortions on Wikipedia, also through his students, funnily enough, who were reading Wikipedia and then told him, you know, what you're teaching us in class doesn't quite align with what Wikipedia says. And so the two of us had a chat about this, and we decided to combine our respective strengths. Dr. Grabowski holds immense expertise in Polish history and historiography, and um, basically he's qualified to evaluate just about any historical claim on this topic. I am not. I am not a historian of Poland. I'm a historian of Italy. My first book is called Italy's Jews for Emancipation to Fascism. It came out with Cambridge in 2018. So I don't even know Polish. But I had been working on Wikipedia with my students for 10 years, and I thought this could be a really interesting challenge to get to know Wikipedia from the inside out. Also, this was mid-COVID, so excavating Wikipedia was a nice relief from what felt at the time, I'm sure everybody remembers, like the end of the world. Jan and I spent 2 years studying this phenomenon, and it's detailed in full in a 60-page study that I will drop into the chat afterwards. And the study was published exactly a year ago by the peer-reviewed journal Journal of Holocaust Research, and that's what Jennifer was mentioning, that that has received so many views. So we dove into Wikipedia's behind the scenes, and this is a vast space that most people don't even know exists, but it's actually a really important space because it's where editors negotiate daily what the rest of the world will know and think. So Jan and I scoured nearly 300 back pages, including talk pages like this, but also other kinds of back pages. So notice boards like this one over here. This is a space where editors can ask questions and request assistance from fellow editors. We looked at arbitration cases, which are spaces on Wikipedia, again, back pages where the most serious disputes happen. So when editors disagree with one another, they can take their spats to this. It's almost like a courtroom. Then we also looked at history logs like this one over here. So everything ever written on Wikipedia remains somewhere in its back pages, recorded in a log. And you can open each of the things in the log and see exactly what was done on Wikipedia with a timestamp. So it stays forever and ever. It's a really kind of fascinating archive for historians. And we looked at these to find, let's say if there was a false claim on Wikipedia, we could use the log to trace it back and see where it had come from. Then we looked at diffs. This is what a diff looks like. Diff is short for difference, and every time a page is changed on Wikipedia, it is recorded as a diff, and you can see what was changed. If it's added, it'll appear in blue. If it was removed, it'll appear in orange. So we looked at hundreds of diffs, and we also interviewed a dozen or so editors. I interviewed them, and then I also gleaned data from Wikipedia's statistical suites. Wikipedia has these handy tools suites which were put together by volunteers, and they're great for seeing tracing article authorship or tracing how a page has changed over time, how it's grown, and so on and so forth. What did we find? What did we find? We found a set of distortions, and before I even go into what they are, I'll just say that the distortions that we found were worried us, and I think should worry anyone because of Wikipedia's vast visibility. So if you take a look at this table over here, you can see that some articles on the Holocaust have a vast, beyond imaginable visibility of 300,000 views per month. And these are actually the less problematic articles, the ones with an article like the Holocaust, because it is so visible, it didn't have many distortions. But you can see even the articles that do not have a lot of views comparatively, like this one over here, looks like it's almost not viewed at all. This is over 1,000 views a month. That's far more than any, academic publication gets. And so most academic books or academic articles have a very modest readership, whether because they're behind a paywall or just because they're, less accessible and very dense, or for whatever reason. So Wikipedia has this tremendous visibility, which is why we should care about what it says. And it is often the first and last point of reference for people's hunt for knowledge. It's what appears in info boxes when you Google. Now with AI, it is it is sort of amplified, right? AI amplifies Wikipedia to a deafening pitch, you can say. So what is it that we actually found? We found that Wikipedia's coverage of Holocaust history follows a narrative that is, I would call a narrative of right-wing Polish nationalists. It is a narrative that whitewashes the role of Polish society in the Holocaust and that bolsters various stereotypes about Jews. So for instance, it will speak about the supposed complicity that Jews had in their own catastrophe in the Holocaust. It will speak about gangs of Jewish collaborators aiding the Gestapo. It will speak about tens of thousands of Poles being murdered by the Germans for trying to save Jews, when the actual number is in the hundreds. So these are various sort of exaggerated, nonsensical statements. We did not find Holocaust denial. So this is not a question of sort of saying that the Holocaust did not exist. It is distortion. It is taking a grain of truth, for instance, the very marginal phenomenon of some Jewish gangs during World War II, and inflating it so much that it seems like Jewish collaboration with the Nazis was a massive phenomenon when it wasn't. And for instance, in that particular case, if there is a page on collaboration with the Axis powers, then we could see that a huge chunk of that page on Wikipedia was taken up by information about Jewish collaboration with the Axis powers, which is again nonsensical. So who has been authoring this content? A group of editors whose usernames you can see over here, or pseudonyms, not even pseudonyms, they're just, usernames. They have these kind of playful names, but there is really nothing playful about them. They are a resilient team who for years methodically and patiently went from article to article, removing and adding content until it aligned with their worldview, or with this worldview of right-wing Polish nationalism and their narrative of World War II. Over here, you can see their dominance in articles on the Holocaust. So if any given article over here, if you look at what its authorship was, which editors actually filled it with content, right? So that other Wikipedia, so that you and I and people who read Wikipedia we could see the content. You can see that this group really dominates. In some cases, they're a hefty minority. And in other cases, like the article on the Nalibuki massacres, they're an actual majority of the editors in terms of their responsibility for the content. How do they distort, or what is the content of their distortions? How do they do it? I'll give a couple of examples. So one example is using fringe sources. There are a number of fringe academics, and I say fringe within the field of Holocaust history. We don't evaluate their work outside of Holocaust history, but certainly within the field of Holocaust history, they have been criticized by mainstream academia, both in Poland and in the rest of the world, for lacking empirical evidence. So Chorykiewicz and Lucas are two such scholars. Their work on Holocaust history has received scathing critiques by mainstream academics. And you can see over here that on Google Scholar, they're really not cited much in comparison to some of the top names in the field. And to give you an example of why they have been so critiqued, here are a couple of quotes you can judge for yourself. So Lucas wrote that the number of Jews hiding in Poland and helped in some way by Poles ran into the hundreds of thousands. This is something that Lucas wrote. Now, no more than 30,000 out of 3 million Polish Jews actually survived the war on Polish territory. No more than 30,000. And some of these survived without Polish help. So to argue that hundreds of thousands of Jews found shelter in Polish homes is nonsensical, right? And that is an example of sort of exaggerating the role that Poles played in saving Jews, and making it seem like so many Jews survived in Poland thanks to Poles. So this is nonsensical. Chodekiewicz implies, and you can see in this quote over here, that Jews brought anti-Semitic violence upon themselves, right? Violence against Jews, he says, this is for the post-war, stemmed from all these different things, but they're basically stemmed from Jews. I will say that he's not a fan of other minorities either. He has an intense dislike for LGBTQ individuals. He's gone on record with blatantly homophobic remarks. And I apologize if this is triggering for anyone, nothing offends God more than throwing semen into the feces. So really horrible things like that he's written. And we have a couple more of those gems in our article if you'd like to see. But again, not surprisingly, Lucas and Chodekiewicz are not cited very much for their work on Google Scholar. Then take a look at what happens on Wikipedia, however. On Wikipedia, their citation count is really high. And why is that? It's because of these distortionist editors who insert them left, right, and center whenever they can. So that's one example of using fringe sources. And then, of course, the information that you get out of these sources is going to be a distortion of history. Another tactic that we've seen on Wikipedia is misrepresentation of sources. And I'll just give you one example that happens to be a visual one, so it's easier to follow. In 2015, this one of the what we call distortionist editors called Poetic Bent inserted into Wikipedia this image that showed a poster written in Yiddish placed just beneath a hammer and sickle sign in Soviet-occupied Bialystok. And Poetic Bent used this caption. He wrote, "Jewish welcoming banner for Soviet forces invading Poland." So again, he inserted this image and used this caption so that someone looks at this, thinks, oh, that's what it is. It's a welcoming banner by Jews for the Soviets. In fact, this image shows nothing of the sort. What it actually reads, this poster actually reads, "Election of delegates for Western Belarusia People's Assembly." And what that means is that this was a Soviet sign advertising Soviet-imposed elections. And the Soviets wrote this in Yiddish, yes, because in Bialystok, over 40% of the population spoke Yiddish. So there was this fake caption, and when you combine that with the photograph's particular composition where you see Hebrew letters directly under the USSR's emblem, the combined result of that bolstered the entrenched stereotype which identifies Jews with communism. And I would add that in a country brutally occupied by the Soviets, but both Germans and the Soviets, Poetic Bent's edit painted Jews indirectly as perpetrators, because again, it showed them as part of the Soviet invader and occupier. This image remained in Wikipedia wrongly captioned for 3 years until 2018 when another editor corrected the description. Let me give you another example of distortion, another one that is, again, slightly visual. There is an article on Wikipedia called Jew with a Coin. If you Google it now, you will see it. And it describes this recent, pretty unsettling phenomenon of Poles collecting miniatures and paintings of quote unquote Jewish looking figures holding money. This kind of artwork always features a male character with a beard, always dressed in Hasidic clothing, almost always large-nosed, dark-skinned or darker skinned, and clutching gold coins or a dollar sign, but usually gold coins. Now, in a country, Poland, where most real Jews were murdered, some precisely because of the stereotype of money-hungry Jews, these kind of objects evoke clear anti-Semitic stereotypes. But lo and behold, on Wikipedia, at the time that we were doing our research, they were not described as such. They were described as a good luck charm in Poland, said to bring good fortune, a harmless superstition, and a positive, sympathetic portrayal of Jewishness. So suddenly on Wikipedia, this was transformed into this kind of quaint art, quaint, almost pro-Jewish portrayal. And today, after our article, after our publication came out, the Jew with a Coin Wikipedia article no longer says exactly this, but it is still pretty distorted. It presents it as debatable. Well, some people say it's controversial, but then others don't. So it is still what I would say is sort of a whitewashing of a clearly anti-Semitic trope. Why is it so hard to counter the distortionists? For one, they command tremendous respect within the Wikipedia community. They are incredibly prolific editors. You can see over here in their most active year of editing, Piotrus, who is one of these distortionist editors, made almost 30,000 editors in a year. Volunteer Marek, another one of these editors, almost 10,000. That is a lot of edits when you consider that most Wikipedia editors make under 1,200 edits a year. So they are really spending hours and hours and hours of their lives editing Wikipedia. And what that means is that they're very well known on Wikipedia, right? This isn't the only area that they edit. In fact, they edit other areas far more. And people know them. Other editors know them. They've developed relationships. They have also been on Wikipedia for a very, very long time, particularly Piotrus and Volunteer Marek, but also Gizzy Cat Bella, who we recently discovered was actually another user who is well known to have been on Wikipedia in a very long time. These editors have been on it for almost 2 decades. And as such, they know everyone on Wikipedia. They know editors and editors know them. When you combine this with the fact that they work in tandem with one another, you can understand how difficult it is, or how difficult it was for other editors who disagreed with them, who really wanted to bring in reliable scholarship to fight these distortions. You can see how difficult it was for them to proceed. And when I interviewed editors, I could see that this dynamic was at play, and how exhausting and how much burnout they had from trying to combat these editors. Now, the problem is not just these editors, and this is where I think it gets really interesting, because this is where I think it tells us so much more about so much more than just the Jewish case or the case of the Holocaust. What I argue is that this problem is a systemic one. And here's how the systemic problem works. So in theory, Wikipedia does have safeguards for protecting itself against fake information and against falsifications and against editors who falsify. So in theory, there is an entire editor community, right? There are thousands of editors. In theory, they can vote to place sanctions on offending editors. So they can place bans, they can place blocks, they can do things that will prevent offending editors from ever editing again on Wikipedia, or from ever editing in a particular area. Furthermore, adding to another security level, there are administrators. Our administrators are also volunteer editors, right? Because I forgot to mention, all editors are volunteers. So administrators are also volunteer editors, but they have special privileges because they've been on Wikipedia for so long, because they've edited so much. And then there are arbitrators who are administrators with even more special privileges. So you've got editors, administrators, arbitrators, and they're all volunteers, but some of them have more privileges than others. And administrators and arbitrators have the ability to sanction editors who violate Wikipedia's policies. And misrepresenting sources is an absolute violation of Wikipedia's policy. So you're not supposed to do it, and you are supposed to be sanctioned if you misrepresent sources. The problem is that in order to judge the fact that source misrepresentation has happened, or in order to judge the fact that a given source is a fringe source and not a mainstream source, or in order to judge the fact that there are that there are distortions or anti-Semitic that there is anti-Semitic content, for that you need expertise. And administrators and arbitrators are not supposed to judge content. For good reason. I think that is a good policy, because none of them are necessarily historians, none of them are necessarily experts. They don't have access to the languages that a historian needs to evaluate this material. They don't have access to the sources. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the time. So Wikipedia has a good system in place that says arbitrators and administrators should not be judging content. That is up to editors to do, and they are supposed to do it through a process of consensus. So let's say someone disagrees with one editor thinks A, the other editor thinks B, they hash it out, they bring in more editors, eventually a consensus is reached. Admins and ARBs, which is the sort of shorthand for that, administrators and arbitrators are not supposed to judge on content. And I would say that's rightly so. But then what happens is that you get this catch-22, because there is a consensus among editors to insert false information, right? If there is a large enough mass of editors, as there is in this case of Holocaust history, who say, this is how we need to represent Jew with a coin, then they have just created a consensus. And if there are only one or two editors who are opposing them in this view, then they cannot break that consensus. And according to Wikipedia rules, no laws were broken. So I call it a catch-22 because the system itself is built in a way that prizes consensus among editors. And what that means is that if you get a large enough group of committed editors who create the impression that there is a consensus about any given falsification, then that falsification just becomes reality, right? So again, to simplify this, or to sort of state this in the extreme, if enough Wikipedia editors were to say that the sun is green, and they would reach a consensus on that, and everybody would agree with them, and only two people say no, that actually the sun is yellow, well, then the sun is green is what would go into Wikipedia. So the problem is systemic. Just to reiterate, it is not just in this area. What often happens is that once this consensus is reached, enough editors notice that there's something wrong in the content and they haven't been able to fix it, and they go to arbitrators and administrators, and they say, look, there is a problem over here with source misrepresentation. You have to do something about this. Because they don't have the expertise, because they're not supposed to judge content, what they do instead is judge conduct. And that leads to this strange situation where editors who might be putting in correct information, but doing so in an aggressive way, or not being polite, or making it personal, will be sanctioned, while editors who put in distorted information, but do it really kindly and really politely, and ask for consensus on the way, and never aggressively revert anyone's work, they will come off without any sanction. So the bottom line, as I put it over here, is it's almost like saying there's no problem distorting, just be polite about it. And again, this is sort of the system at place. So I think I will end over there, and I'm really happy to take any questions. I'm also happy to speak about what has happened on Wikipedia since our article has been published. Yeah, what do you think, Jennifer? Is it okay if we move to some Q&A, and then I can take those?
Yes, I think it's a good time to move to Q&A. Sure, thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating talk about Wikipedia. I learned a lot about the nuts and bolts of how it works, kind of things that one doesn't tend to think about when it comes to Wikipedia, but also wondering, like, how is so much of this very problematic material being allowed to go up there, and particularly from some places where Holocaust denial is actually a crime. So I will start with the first question. Somebody would like to know what has happened with Wikipedia since your article was published, whether or not that gained traction within the Wikipedia community.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I actually do have a slide on this. I just didn't want to go over time, but why don't I pull that up since it's easier to explain through that. So as was mentioned at first, our study, we were really fortunate in that it went viral. I mean, one of the things that we made sure of was that it would be open access. As you know, most academic publications are behind a paywall, particularly if they're peer reviewed, because the journals need to make money. We got funding so that it would be widely available because we felt this was such an important issue. So it went viral. Now, last time I checked, it's at around 55 or 56,000. Just to clarify that's a lot for an academic article, particularly a 60-page academic article. Most of the other things I published are read by like my mom and a person or something like that. But anyway, this was it had enormous visibility. It was covered in over 12 languages. And we had a lot of interest from the Wikipedia community as far as what was wrong. And one of the things it led to was an arbitration case. So like about maybe 2 weeks after the publication, or 3 weeks, the arbitration committee got together. This is sort of again the like the High Court of Justice of Wikipedia, like the Supreme Court of Wikipedia, and they got together and they opened a case in the wake of our article. And it was some of it was encouraging and some of it was not. The good thing was that because our article went viral and it attracted so much attention, there were suddenly a lot more editors who were looking at these articles and looking at the distortions that we called attention to. And you know how they say sunshine is the best disinfectant. And so once people started looking at this, they made changes. So there was some pretty significant cleanup of articles, and that was good. The less encouraging aspect was that this systemic problem that I had noticed reared its ugly head again, and exactly the same things that we were pointing to happened in this arbitration case, which is that that the arbitrators and the administrators could not really see what the problem was because they did not have this expertise. And so they ended up ruling over conduct and not over content violations. And that is why one of the foremost distortionists, Piotrush, walked free. He even got a commendation from the arbitration committee for behaving so nicely. 2 distortionists were banned, so that's good, but only for 12 months. So we'll see what happens. It'll be very soon. It'll be in May when their ban is lifted. And then a couple of what I call the good guys, a couple of people who had been making good edits were also banned. And this is invariably what ends up happening with almost every ARPCON case on this topic. It's like they just give a slap on the wrist to both sides, and life goes on. So good and bad as far as the effect of our article. Thanks for that really good question.
Another question that we got talks about addressing exactly this in a classroom. And I think that as somebody who also teaches, one of the first things, I don't know if you tell your student, well, I know you use Wikipedia as a teaching tool, but I tell my students when they're writing research papers, like Wikipedia is not a reliable source to write your papers. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how professors and faculty at universities, but also faculty in K through 12 schools can teach students to use this and think about Wikipedia critically as well.
Yeah. People are often surprised to hear this, but I actually think Wikipedia is pretty great. I mean, for all of its problems, I think it's so much better than what we had before. If you think of something like the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is so limited and really so West centric, and kind of is, if you look at history articles in Encyclopedia Britannica, it's sort of basically history written by old white men. Wikipedia has tremendous advantages in providing or giving a voice to previously marginalized groups like women, like LGBTQ, like anyone who's not white, like indigenous communities in this country. I mean, these are people who have been left out of the story for so long. And I think Wikipedia is fantastic in that sense, that because it is democratized, it is giving voice to groups that have never had a voice in the sort of corpus of what I would call corpus of public knowledge. That said, there are these dangers as well. I don't think that you should throw the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that I don't think we need to completely disregard Wikipedia or be afraid of it. I use Wikipedia all the time for sort of general knowledge issues. But I think you're absolutely right. I think if we're doing a research paper, we can use, if we want to be rigorous, then we can look at Wikipedia's sources and footnotes as a starting point for our research, but not to take what Wikipedia says as the be all and end all of information. So I think that's a good idea. As far as kids, I guess in K through 12, I haven't really thought of that. That's a really good question. I mean, again, I just think that critical thinking and reading critically is super important. I have 2 8-year-olds, and and when we read bedtime stories, and I say, challenge this for me, like what is wrong with this, or what is wrong with that, and I think there are ways to read Wikipedia critically, but again, it is a slippery slope, because we don't always know that what we're reading is an error.
Thank you for that. The next question I have is another very interesting one about this, and it deals with the languages that articles on Wikipedia are written in. Have you considered how these topics are dealt with in other languages? So I'll just use a bit of an example. German Wikipedia, which the same as you, like I will go and use for general knowledge as well, tends to have very, very well fleshed out articles that use legitimate academic sources to cite them. But have you looked into the language piece of this at all?
Yeah. So when we were doing our research, it was interesting. Jan Grabowski, who reads and speaks Polish, was looking at some of these entries in the Polish Wikipedia, and found that, to his surprise, that they were actually better than the entries in the articles in the English Wikipedia. So less distorted, and we think that is because it is important for right-wing Polish nationalists to tell the story outside of Poland. In Poland, they're kind of preaching to the choir. I mean, there is already a large number who hold these views, but in outside of Poland, it's not very common, and so that was our idea for why this happens. That editors are spending more of their energy on Anglophone audiences. I will say that one of my projects since then has been looking at the Hebrew Wikipedia, which is no less distorted than the English one, and it too has kind of been taken over by the nationalist right wing among Israeli Jews. and it too is again full of distortions. So I don't think this is by any means A, either exclusive to English Wikipedia, or B, exclusive to the area of the Holocaust. I don't think it is a story just about anti-Semitism. I think it is a story about who controls knowledge, and who gets to, whose narrative gets to drown out the other side's narrative.
Wonderful. That the next question actually really nicely answer. We had somebody write in and say that Wikimedia's CEO is speaking this evening on Wikipedia's future in the age of AI. And they're wondering if you can share your thoughts on distortions in the advent of an AI future. And I know that's something that we here at the Shoah Foundation are thinking about a lot as well.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's sort of happening as we speak, right? And it's moving so quickly that it's difficult to take a step back and say, you know, here's what's happening and here's how it's going to affect us. It's such uncharted territory that it's hard to know. But yeah, from what I've seen, I mean, so AI and Wikipedia have an interesting relationship. There's this whole discussion now among Wikipedians on whether AI should be used or can be used to write Wikipedia articles. And then on the other side of it, when AI like ChatGPT or any of these other AI platforms, when they create, when AI creates knowledge, it draws on Wikipedia. So there's an interesting sort of symbiotic relationship between the two. I don't know. It's a brave new world out there with AI now. I do think it's I mean, this is neither here nor there, but I do think it has some amazing applications, and I actually encourage my students to use AI, let's say, to correct their grammar or to correct their spelling mistakes. But I also do exercises with my students when I have them ask AI a question, like a historical question, and then we'll analyze it together and see how wrong it is. One of my favorites is I ask it to write a bio of Dr. Shira Klein, and it just fills it with the most fantastical claims that I got my PhD at UCLA and my postdoc at USC, and like things that are just completely fabricated. I think as AI gets better, we're going to have a different kind of conversation. I think that's where we are right now, though. It spews so much junk.
Yeah, it definitely does. We have another question. This person wants to know, how do these distortions play into, I would also say, spark and fuel contemporary anti-Semitism, particularly that which we see vis-a-vis Israel and the anti-Zionism, anti-Israel rhetoric. They're wondering how that borrows from some of these tropes that are being presented on Wikipedia.
Wow. That's a controversial one. Just for the record, Jennifer, this did not come from me. Okay, so I mean, I think that this has nothing to do with that. I think it's a really good question. I think in the day and age that we're in, you might sort of make these ties. I think what we're seeing on Wikipedia is solely related to Poland and has no bearing whatsoever on what is happening in the Middle East. It predated October 7th, and so it just really has nothing to do with that. I'll go further than that, and I'll say that in the minds of most scholars of anti-Semitism, critique of Israel is not anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And that is what the Jerusalem Declaration is all about. This is a declaration by 350 scholars of Jewish history and of anti-Semitism and of genocide and of the Holocaust, who have decoupled this this association between criticizing what Israel is doing and and anti-Semitism. So I am among those scholars. I don't think that the criticism that we're seeing in the wake of Israel bombing Gaza, I don't think that is or it isn't necessarily anti-Semitism, and it certainly does not relate to this distortion that I've laid out on Wikipedia. Yeah, I'll just add to that I think Wikipedia is actually a pretty trustworthy place to get information on Israel-Palestine. And again, when I look at the Hebrew Wikipedia and its coverage of the war right now versus English Wikipedia and its coverage of the war, where the distortions lie are in the Hebrew Wikipedia. And that is something that is noticed by a whole lot of Hebrew Wikipedia editors as well. Again, there is no consensus in Hebrew Wikipedia. There's a bit of a war between right and left on Hebrew Wikipedia.
Thank you. I know that is even among scholars, it's a very difficult issue to navigate. So thank you for your answer to that question. We actually have an undergraduate who has written in and asked a question about maybe talking about how Wikipedia has helped conspiracy theories modernize. So blood libel, which we had a presentation on a few weeks ago. He also was wondering if you have any specific anecdotes that you could use to illustrate how those conspiracy theories have been perpetuated by online sources such as Wikipedia.
Yeah, there was a conspiracy, or there was like a hoax basically on Wikipedia in this area. It was uncovered even before our article. It was uncovered by Haaretz, which is this Israeli newspaper, and it was called like the longest standing hoax on Wikipedia or something like that. Basically, let me just find it. So basically, there was a claim on Wikipedia, an entire article on Wikipedia about a concentration camp in Warsaw that supposedly had annihilated 200,000 non-Jewish Poles in a giant gas chamber. And it ended, and no such thing had ever happened, but it was on Wikipedia for 15 years. So that's an example of a hoax. That was, like I said, debunked before we came onto the scene. But it's something that still has sort of echoes on Wikipedia. It's still brought up as a controversial issue, and Wikipedia actually has its own page on hoaxes on Wikipedia, and it is one of them. Yeah, what was the other question, Jennifer, about anecdotes? I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. He was wondering if you had any other specific anecdotes, like kind of the one that you gave about George, or the image of the Jew with the coins that have been basically perpetuated in this online space.
Yeah, well, I mean, our article is full of them. There's like 60 pages worth of them, of examples. One that I noticed after our article came out that people were talking about was about the role of the IPN. The IPN is this body in Poland that sponsors a lot of research, and it was only after our article was published that we realized that was another case. But yeah, nothing offhand. But again, our article is full of examples. I mean, I have a lot of examples, but none of them are quite so easy or kind of immediate as the ones that I brought. That's why I bring them into the presentation, because they're sort of in your face and easy to see. The other ones really require a lot more digging and explication, and it's more about sort of who said what and when and where, and showing that it's a distortion. But yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. We don't have any other questions at the moment, so I'm going to ask people, if you have any last minute questions, please write them in and we'll ask them of Dr. Klein. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask you a question. As somebody who works, my own scholarship looks at women's reproductive health and reproductive health networks. So I'm interested to know, if you've been able to suss out whether or not there are some of these transnational knowledge networks of Holocaust distortionists who are working in conjunction with one another on Wikipedia articles.
Yeah, interesting. We haven't uncovered any networks. And I get asked that a lot. I get asked, like, is this a group that is working sort of maybe serving the government, or serving like, like an organization, or are they being paid by someone? Are there these networks? Are they planning it out? Our sense that nothing of the sort is happening. Our sense is that these editors met one another on Wikipedia, and they just happened to share this same ideological sort of drive. We've also been really careful not to psychologize them and say, why they're doing it. I'm very careful. I don't think that they are anti-Semitic. I don't think that they are bad people. I do think that they have a narrative which is mistaken, which plays into the hands of right-wing nationalists, who some of whom are self-avowedly anti-Semitic. But the editors themselves were very careful not to make assumptions about where they come from, in their kind of political trajectory, what moves them, what drives them. Yeah, as a scholar, I'm very careful to make assumptions on that, and I haven't seen any sort of webs of that would suggest something much larger than just a bunch of individuals who think similarly.
Very, very interesting. That is not necessarily what I would have expected either. So, we have one last question that's come in. Someone wants to know the ways in which Wikipedia may or may not be linked to other types of, or may or may not be linked to social media. Wikipedia is of course not social media, but whether or
Yeah.
not there's any congruence between Wikipedia and maybe Instagram or TikTok.
I'll just say that Wikipedia is forked everywhere, and forked, that means that its information is copied and pasted into multiple sources of information, including social media. So if you take like a phrase from Wikipedia about any given topic, I did this the other day on, I think, this a historical figure, King Faisal, I think it was. And I Googled a sentence from him on Wikipedia. I found it in like 20 different sources that are not Wikipedia, but clearly all of them had been taken from Wikipedia. And oftentimes when people argue on social media, they'll just lift things off Wikipedia, which I think is more reliable than, social media, simply by virtue of how many people are involved in it and that it requires a consensus. But yeah, I think it's that social media is mirroring Wikipedia to a large extent.
Okay, wonderful. We don't have any more questions, and we've exuded a lot of very interesting information and answers from you on this. So I think I'm going to go ahead and close the webinar for now. But Shira, I just want to say thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating talk, which I also think is incredibly important scholarship, not only for those of us who are academics, but also for the general public to understand too, that we have ways in which we approach these sites. I also want to thank everybody who came and who asked a question. And I do apologize again for all of the technological difficulties at the beginning of this. We're going to be closing this now. And again, many thanks to everybody. Shira, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.